I actually encourage people to think about their stories because quite often they could be more powerful than the numbers that represent them.
Welcome back to Digital Dominance. This show has always been centered around digital marketing because this is an area of growing importance as our society becomes more and more online oriented. A lot of people think that if you figure out the magic combination of software and automation, then that's all you need to be successful. Tools are, of course, important, but we've also spent multiple episodes talking about knowing your target customer because once you know them, you can communicate with them and create a connection. A well researched and well written sales page that is ugly will drastically outperform a flashy sales page that was thrown together at the last minute. And that's because there are people on the other side of that page, and it's the people that matter. So, to continue this human centric marketing focus, I've invited Cal Fussman onto the show. Cal seems to have the Midas touch when it comes to asking great questions and fostering authentic connections. He's a New York Times bestselling author, he's a masterful storytelling coach, and he's been captivating audiences for decades. When you hear Cal speak, he's pulling from an extensive history of conversations and interviews with household names. He sat down with world leaders like Jimmy Carter, Nelson Mandela, sports figures from Muhammad Ali to Kobe Bryant, and many entrepreneurs and celebrities from Robert De Niro to Richard Branson. So I'm super excited for our conversation today. Welcome to Digital Dominance, Cal.
It is an exciting day for Cal Fussman to be on a podcast called Digital Dominance. So I'm really happy to meet you, Jeffro, and looking forward to seeing where this is all going.
Yeah, well, I'm really happy to have you here. Earlier this week, I was going through your LinkedIn profile, and I love that you included the role of caretaker for your dad, just as if it was like any other job, right? I think a lot of people try to paper over gaps in their employment because I don't know if they're embarrassed or maybe they put something in there like freelancing consulting work or working on my novel. So what prompted you to include that?
So what happened was I was living in LA between 2008 and 2020 and moved out to help Larry King, the CNN broadcaster, write his soup to nuts autobiography.
Hmm.
And I ended up becoming very close friends with him. And we had breakfast almost every day for 12 years whenever we were in town. And when the COVID hit, basically all the restaurants got closed, and Larry had some health problems. And my dad was turning 90 in North Carolina. And so I just knew I had to go back and just take care of him during this time. So my wife and I moved back to North Carolina, and we took that year, and a little more than a year, and just were with him every day and had dinner with him every night and watched a movie with him every night, sometimes a double feature. And it's a decision I will never, ever regret. And it wasn't like one of those movies where there were all kinds of problems and they get resolved at the last second over the bedside. We had basically talked everything out, but it was really being there day after day after day. And he, at one point, dropped his iPhone and went to pick it up, and he fell and broke his pelvis and had to go into rehab. And we were just there. And it's a beautiful thing to do. Everybody's got different relationships, but if you can help somebody who has given you their everything from the time you were born, if you can step in and help them when they need it, it's a beautiful feeling.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's other people that might choose to do that and take care of a family member, but they wouldn't put it on their resume or LinkedIn profile, right? And that I think really reflects on you as the kind of person you are, who's transparent and, it humanizes you and allows people to relate to you. But yeah, do you have any other comment on that?
Well, the only thing I can tell you is people have actually written or emailed me to or written on LinkedIn. Wow, like you never or very rarely see experience listed that way. And in fact, the bulk of what people know me about was work that I did for Esquire magazine, where I interviewed the icons of the last 75 years. And because of some of the experiences I had that I put up at top, you actually have to click to go down and see what I'm kind of famous for. And it was actually been pointed out to me, Cal, you really should bring that up because a lot of people want to see that first. So I it made me think, but I decided to keep it up there because it's like you're saying, it's authentically me. And if they're really interested, keep they'll keep clicking.
Yeah. Well, and I think you're setting a good example for others to show, you can let people know that you have a personal side. We all do, obviously. So sometimes it's kind of silly to try and hide that.
There's another point, Jeffro, here that a lot of people are either they don't understand or they may be too scared to take the risk. I can produce a metaphor that anybody in the working world could understand. If you have a bad experience in the working world, obviously you don't want it in front of everybody. You just want to move on and prosper in the next step. But I heard a story of a young man who, when COVID hit, he was in high school and it just knocked him for a loop. And in I think it was his sophomore year, his grade point was 0.00. And so what he recovered, it might have been his freshman year, but you're starting with a year of 0.00, and he got it up to like a 3.3 or 3.4 by being almost perfect. And yet, if you just look at the final result, like the top institutions would just say, no, no, like the computer is just going to throw him off to the side. And my point is that the story of what he went through to get that 0.00 and then come back and be nearly perfect to lift himself up to a pretty high level, but not to the level where you can get into an Ivy League school. The story is more important than the numbers. And a lot of people don't realize that. And that's one. Number two, in every story is vulnerability. There is just no good story without a central vulnerable character. It just doesn't exist. If the central character is not vulnerable, nobody's going to lean forward to see what happens. And so I actually encourage people to think about their stories because quite often they could be more powerful than the numbers that represent them.
Right. Well, and I love how you're able to focus on that and draw it out because, like you said, everybody skips over that. When we look at the Olympics, we remember the people who got first place, not necessarily the ones that overcame impossible odds and only got second place. Right. So I love that you focus on that. And do you think that is one of the things that makes you special as an interviewer?
What makes me special as an interviewer goes back to a time where I was about 23 or 24 years old. To backtrack, if I was telling this story over 2 hours, I would start with the fact that, or the story of how when I was just turned 7, I was in second grade, and President John F. Kennedy was shot, and the teacher came, left the room, came back in a different person, told the class. We were all sent home, and I, having just turned 7, I couldn't figure out what it would be like for the vice president to step up and take that oath of office. Like, how did he feel? Was he happy to be the president? Was he sad because it was only because of the assassination? Or was he scared because maybe he thought they would try and kill him too? And so I sat down and I wrote the new president a letter. And 6 months later, I'd forgotten all about it, that I put it in the mailbox. I got a letter back from Lyndon B. Johnson. And it was a letter that kind of changed my life because I knew that if you understand the power of a question, you get to the most powerful person on earth. And so I knew I would be asking questions. Many people don't know what they're going to be when they're 7. I understood it. And my dream as a kid back in the days where newspapers were the biggest way of communicating, like in a city, I expected to be that person who wrote a column and you could see their face, and every day you picked up the paper to see what they had to say. And I went to school. After that, I graduated and basically got to a big newspaper and saw my face in that paper writing a column. And a lot of things happened, but the bottom line is I had to make a choice. Am I going to now do this for the rest of my life? Or is there something bigger out there? And I took time off to travel just to see different things. And this is where the answer to your question really zones in. Like, what made you interview the way you do?
Hmm.
I didn't have much money and very little. What I would do is I would go to a train station or a bus station and I would buy a ticket to a destination. It didn't matter where it was going. What mattered to me was the empty seat on the train or the bus and the person that it was next to. Because I was going to sit in that seat and I knew when that train started rolling, a conversation was going to get started. And by the end of that trip, by the end of that conversation, I basically needed them to like invite me home and ask if I'd like to stay or if I'd like to have dinner because I had no money, not enough money to spend on hotels. And so what happened is when I started to sit in that seat and people started to invite me home, they then created parties because it was like something exotic was happening. This is a day before the Berlin Wall came down. So now I'm like the centerpiece of a party, meeting all these people who are then inviting me to their homes and then telling me about their relatives and sending me their relatives. And I traveled this way for roughly 10 years without a home, going around the world to where people pointed me to, or I may have just bought a ticket and got on the train and looked for that empty seat. And it was in that empty seat that I learned trust because I literally was asking people to trust me enough to take me home and offer me a bed to sleep that night. And that trust is what went into all of the interviews when I came back and I'm interviewing Mikhail Gorbachev, who became the last leader of the Soviet Union, or Muhammad Ali. They felt that. And so the interviews often were different from anything that they encountered. And that's where it came from.
Right. Well, I mean, that's amazing because a lot of people who are journalists or interviewers asking questions a certain way is a skill they learn in journalism school. But for you, this was a way of life. This was a matter of survival, literally. And so it just comes out of you naturally. You have to be authentically interested in the person and caring about the answers to their questions and listening to what they're saying. And that's you, right? There's no line there between personal and professional. This is how you connect with the world and with individuals. So that's remarkable.
That's a great point, and I'm happy you brought up the listening because that is what makes all the difference. And Larry King once told me he was interviewed all the time, and it would drive him crazy when interviewers showed up with notebooks with their questions like written out one to 20 or whatever, and just following what they wrote down instead of listening to what he was saying and responding to it or amplifying it. And so one time a woman was going through those questions and she actually, after she would ask the question, she was like looking down at her nails or she wasn't even caring about what he said and then moving on to the next question. And so he just started inventing answers that had nothing to do with the questions. And she just kept rolling right on. And I don't know. Only Larry King would do that because he was a comedian at heart. If he hadn't been the guy on suspenders asking questions to world leaders, he would have wanted to be a stand-up comic. So, but it brings back to your point. If you're not listening, nobody's going to trust you.
Right, and you're never gonna get past those surface level answers, right? There's no reason to open that door.
And wouldn't the same apply for sales?
Exactly. Yeah, and I mean that's the natural segue into this, right? We have business owners listening, and if you want to understand how does asking good questions apply to a business, this is how, right? Sales is really about connecting and trust, because customers have so many options. They can Google, find dozens of options in their area for who to hire and work with. But when they're on the phone with you, your job isn't to say, okay, here's our packages. Which one do you want? You got to find out, okay, what's the actual problem here? Because sometimes you got to dig a little bit. Maybe they've tried something before, the thing that you offered, and it failed. But you won't know that until you've uncovered and talked with them and kind of listened and drawn that out, because then you can actually address the issue that they have, not the one you assume they have.
I went into a company to monitor a sales team because they wanted to see like how the sales team was asking questions, listening, and telling the story about the product. And we went through this a few times, and the leader of the sales team was talking to the group about it. And he said, "You know what the difference is between Cal and us? He's actually listening to the answers. You're already thinking about what you want to say next to make the sale." But the reality is, if you're listening, and people can see when you're listening, they can sense it, and they can sense when you're just allowing the words to come out and waiting for the pause so that they can jump in with the pitch. And listening is so important. And I get it. In sales, there's you got a quota. The time is really important. You got to get your information out. You got to move things forward. But you know what? Maybe just taking a little more time to actively listen would pay off big time as the process keeps rolling.
Right. You got to slow down to speed up, because otherwise you're going to have a lot more sales calls before you get one closed. Whereas if you spend a little time on each one, all right, you're more likely to get more closes because the people feel like you've heard them, you understand their problem, and you are able to fix it. You're not just forcing something on them because that's your job.
There you go.
So that's, an interesting dynamic when you're one-on-one, back and forth in a conversation, phone call, Zoom call. What about, when a business owner wants to run a survey to their clients? There's no back and forth, but they want to know what their clients think. They can be intentional, really wanting to understand this, but how should they approach writing those questions in order to get the most helpful and meaningful answers, and feel like they've been heard and understood?
That's so interesting because I came upon a company that actually pays people to like play video games for money. Like if you reach a certain level, you get a certain amount of money in a certain amount of time because the company wants to understand how the players are thinking. And companies have surveys that they want filled out, just like, and they're willing to pay to have those surveys pulled out because a lot of it is the the timing that we have. I mean, think about it. If somebody wants to ask you 20 or 30 questions and you're in the middle of a packed day, are you going to even give it a look?
Nope.
Now, so it really does seem to me that if it's at all applicable to incentivize with something maybe from the product so that people will say that this is a good deal to take this survey, and then making the questions, coming up with questions that make people do this. They have to think for a second. It's not just yes, no, yes, no. And then when somebody is forced to think that way, they're appreciative of the question because when you're looking up like that, you're reaching deep into yourself. And when you're reaching deep into yourself, it's important to you. Something deep down, there's some kind of memory there. And when you pull it up, it has a reaction. And maybe it was a terrible reaction. And maybe something in the survey is going to get a really bad mark. But wasn't that what you were looking for? And so if you can get the customer to just look up and think, which means that they're really looking down to dredge something up, then you're going to win. If you're just asking yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, okay, you're going to get data, but I wonder how truly authentic it's going to be. So
And I think the same applies not just yes and no questions, but also the rate this on a scale of 1 to 10. Because even if they go through that thought process, you now reduce it to an 8 and you have no idea how they got there. So you need the open ended questions.
exactly, there was a wine critic named Robert Parker who for years was he literally could determine the prices of the wines that got sent out because before they were sent out he would taste them and he would give them grades generally between like 70 and 100. And if wine is very competitive, there are so many wines in Bordeaux. If you're to go into a wine store and you're going to look at them, how are you going to know? Well, it came down to what did Parker say? And what Parker said was a number. And man, you talk to these people who were making the wine in France, Parker drove them nuts. Like, why? How can they give me an 88? And like the difference between an 88 and a 91 was a lot of money. And it's completely subjective. And if you have Robert Parker's taste, great. But what if you don't and you're just told, oh, Robert Parker says 94? Great, I'll get it. So surveys really can probably be rethought to get to what the companies really want to know.
Right. So, I mean, it kind of leads me to my next question, though. As a business owner, they obviously want to make money. Do you think that the profit motive interferes with someone's ability to ask these good, authentic questions?
No, I think it overlaps. Man, you talk to the CEOs, they want to know. They really want to know. And I can't imagine that they want to turn away from the way their customers are thinking about their product. It just doesn't make sense. Their company depends on it. So, putting the time into the questions you're asking people is a valuable asset. You know, listen, you just look at it this way, Jeffro. And these are the simplest things. This is talking about childhood curiosity and the ability to ask a transformational question, a question that's going to give you information that may not have been expected. And then the power of listening to the answer. And then the power of telling the story of your product based on what you've put into it and what your customers have gotten out of it. Those three simple things. And look, it's got artificial intelligence and uh, all the data out there, which I'm all for. But if you just went back to the basics, you're going to get the answers you're looking for. And I'll back this up with one story that I just heard about a coach he was coaching middle school and high school players, and then Nike hired him, and he went to a 3 a.m. workout of Kobe Bryant. And he's watching Kobe work out, and Kobe's doing these basic drills that he was giving his seventh graders to do. And at the end of the workout, Kobe goes over to him and he says, what do you think? And he said, I don't understand, Kobe. Like this same drills that I'm teaching seventh graders, you're doing, and you're like the best player in the world. And Kobe said, that's exactly why I'm the best player in the world, because I never got bored or tired with the basics. There you go.
The fundamentals. So any good CEO is going to understand that and want to, you know, get to the root of what drives the customer, what makes them tick in order to move that business forward. So I like that they do overlap in that sense. We are at the end of our time though, Cal. I love hearing all your stories. Thank you for spending time with us today. I sincerely hope that businesses continue to become more personal and authentic. And I think your insights can help us move in that direction. So, for those of you guys listening, go connect with Cal on LinkedIn, hire him as your next keynote speaker, go read one of his books. Cal, would you like to leave our audience with a question to ponder?
With a question to ponder. What, that should be for a philosopher. But you know what, Tim Ferris had me on his podcast a few years ago, and the question he asked me was, "What would you put up on billboards if you could put up any message to people who are driving by? What message would you put on the billboards?" And I didn't need to even take a second or two. I just said, "Listen." And so everybody's going to have a different answer, but I think that's a great question. What message would you have for anybody who could put up a message on a billboard? And I think you'll get to the essence of the person answering that question. And it's going to be very different. Most people wouldn't say listen, only I'll say listen, and you just found out why. But they'll find out something I found out something about myself when I answered that question. So I'm happy to pass it on and very grateful that Tim Ferriss passed it on to me.
I appreciate that. Well, thanks again for being here, Cal. Thanks to all of you for listening. Let's all try to ask better questions, be better listeners, and I'll see you back here for the next episode of Digital Dominance. Take care.
Thank you, Jeffro.